and welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for August 9th, 2012. This program provides network news, highlights, and discussion on cyber threats and countermeasures for those threats. I'm Jim Clausing, and joining me today is Matt Kaiser. Matt, what do you have to talk about today?
We have two really big stories today, Jim. The first is the so-called epic hacking of Mat Honan, a reporter for Gizmodo. And this is a good story because it shows that almost no technical knowledge is needed to completely, unfortunately, ruin somebody's digital life. The second story is a new breaking story from Kaspersky, who claims to have found a new related malware in the same family as the Flame malware, which is also related to Stuxnet and Dooku. The interesting bit about this one is that it's a banking Trojan, which is completely out there for what we're used to for what we're assuming is state-sponsored malware. So let's start on the first one. Recently, reporter Mat Honan of Gizmodo found himself completely locked out of his own digital life, and the attackers actually contacted him through his secondary Twitter account, which he created after the fact, to explain to him how it was done. And it's interesting because it requires almost no technical skill, but a lot of social engineering skill. So what happened first is that the attackers decided they needed to get access to his Twitter account. The whole point of the hack was really to get access to Honan's Twitter. His handle was @MAT, 3 letters long, which in some circles is pretty valuable, a very short Twitter handle. In order to do that, they needed access to his Gmail. To get access to his Gmail, they used a very circuitous route involving Amazon, Apple's .me email service, and some trickery, which is kind of an interesting thing. The first thing that the attackers did is they called up Amazon, and they provided certain details, the account name, the email address, and the billing address, which is mostly public information, and added a new credit card number to that account over the phone. They then hung up and called back, got a different operator, and using that newly added credit card and the same details they provided before, they added a new email address to that account. Through that, they were able to reset the password to Amazon and get access to Honan's account details. Next step, on the day of the attack at 4:33 p.m., the attacker calls up AppleCare, claiming to be Mat Honan, but doesn't have any answers to the security questions. However, AppleCare allows him to get away with the password reset, providing only Honan's physical address, any credit card number, Honan's billing address, and the last 4 digits of Honan's credit card number, which the attackers had just stolen from Amazon. At 4:50 p.m., the attacker uses that information to reset Honan's apple.me email password, locking him out of the account. Next up, the attacker requests a Gmail password reset. Where does that reset email go to? To the .me account, which is attacker-controlled. And from there, the attacker confirms the reset and then is able to control Honan's Gmail account. Now, that's the key to the kingdom. Using that, it's tied to his iCloud account, and iCloud devices have a remote feature for remote wipe. So at 5 p.m., they remotely wipe his iPhone. 5:01, they remotely wipe his iPad. 5:02, the real point of the attack, they reset his Twitter password based on his Gmail credentials. I personally think that the point of the 2 wipes was to distract him briefly so that he wouldn't notice the password reset. In conversing with the attacker claims that somebody else involved with the hack is the person responsible for wiping those 2 accounts. If you want to trust the word of a hacker, I guess you can. And then at 5:05, they remotely wiped his MacBook as well. So he had, relying on his Apple devices, he had no way of preventing the attack. He eventually had to call up Apple, work his way through their support system, including wasting a good amount of time because they had misheard his name on the phone. And finally, at 5:12, the attackers posted a victory announcement on Honan's own account, @Matt. So a little involved, but if you notice, there was almost no technical skill involved. It was all being able to converse with people on the phone, convince them who you're not, that you are who you aren't, and almost a verbal form of privilege escalation.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I read an account from Honan himself after the fact that, it said he hadn't been doing a good job of backing up his MacBook, so he lost, years worth of pictures and stuff on there too.
Mm-hmm. That includes all the photos he'd taken of his daughter, which if I was a parent, I'd be completely heartbroken to lose those.
Yeah, I guess, it's clear that this was mostly, entirely a social engineering attack. This didn't take any, new 0 days or anything. This was all old school social engineering attacks.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one more important point before we leave this is that Amazon has taken some steps to prevent the exact attack here, the social engineering attack that took place here. And Apple has, at least for the time being, prevented doing some of this stuff over the phone as well. So they are both looking into how this kind of fell through the cracks and taking steps to address them.
So you may be asking yourself, how can I prevent something like this from happening to me? One step that I would take if you're using Gmail, they have two-factor authentication as an option, which allows you an out-of-band authentication mechanism. If you have a smartphone, you can install software that will give you a password that rotates every minute, and that will give you a little bit of extra protection. If you've got a non-smartphone, that can also be delivered to you via SMS, sort of a challenge. It's not foolproof, but it will give you a good amount of strength to your existing passwords. And also, don't link accounts. Try not to allow yourself to. Some sites will allow you to log in with credentials from another account into different sites. Usually, it's convenient, but it's really not a good idea because that allows one person who has passwords to one of them to access all of them.
Yeah, those were the two things that I was thinking of too. I personally turned on two-factor authentication on my Google account some time ago, months, maybe a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
And
it is a little bit inconvenient, but it's worth the peace of mind, in my opinion.
It can be, but exactly. It requires that extra step, and the linking of accounts. People want to do that for convenience. I can't count the number of sites I've been to lately that ask if I want to log in with my Facebook credentials, and the idea of that scares the crap out of me as a security person. But I had turned on two-factor authentication after I heard about the incident of James Fallows, who's a columnist for The Atlantic magazine. His wife's Gmail account got hacked and lost over 5 years worth of stuff there. And just reading about the issues that he had gone through was enough that when two-factor authentication became an option for everybody, I turned it on for mine. But are there any other ideas you can think of? I can't off the top of my head. Those are the two main ones that come to mind: is the two-factor authentication and don't link them.
Well, looking at the Wired article that came out after the fact, that actually has some good suggestions. They say things like setting your security questions to things that aren't really publicly available. Now, the problem with that is that in the case of Mat Honan, the security questions that were acquired by Apple weren't, anything that he could control. They were the ones setting the parameters.
Well, and they allowed you to, if you forgot them, to some other method that you were able to figure out from elsewhere.
So I think the onus is really on the companies. The difficulty with this is that you have to get everyone to agree what's sensitive information and what's not, because some sites will treat mother's maiden name as private information, other ones may not.
Another idea that I've heard some people use is they make up answers to those security questions for that particular site. The issue for me would be trying to remember what I thought my mother's maiden name was for that particular site.
So if they ask you what high school you went to, you talk about, I don't know, what your favorite hot dog or something silly like that, like what your favorite flavor of ice cream is, or your answer is something completely unrelated.
Right, and I know people who do that. It would be a pain for me to try to keep track of all of that, so I haven't been doing that, but I may reconsider after this.
And then you end up writing them down, which is, I mean, you may as well have written down your password at that point.
Yeah, well, I would store them in,
in a password safe.
That's encrypted someplace, but.
All right. Well, the second story for today is the interesting tale of Gauss. Now, Kaspersky just today released a report claiming to have found malware that seems related to the Flame platform, which has been making headlines recently for being tied to Stuxnet, Dooku, or other really well-developed and potentially state-sponsored malware. The interesting thing that Gauss brings to the table is that it's designed to steal credentials for banks, making it a banking Trojan, effectively. Now, that's something that's new to the scene of state-sponsored malware. Usually you see mostly done for spying purposes. But here it seems to be developed particularly to steal from Lebanese banks, suggesting that the target is, in fact, Lebanon. Here we have a diagram of the different modules. Modules here are some of them are named after, I believe is it philosophers, or is it Gödel is famous thinkers, I guess.
Yeah, mathematicians.
Mathematicians, that's right.
The reason that I thought this part was interesting is for those of you out there who might be trying to figure out if you got some sort of infection like this in your enterprise, these modules give you some ideas, some potential indicators of compromise. In particular, the one that would probably be most useful would be looking for that registry key, looking for a large binary value in there, because the timestamp would be a relatively small value. So if there's a large value called timestamp for UI, that should raise some flags. That's primarily the reason I wanted to include this. But
so here, looking at a graph that Kaspersky's put together, you can see that the overwhelming number of infections are from IPs within Lebanon. This also correlates with the explicit targets of the malware. If you look at the code, there are modules in there that look for cookies related to particular Lebanese banks: Bank of Beirut, Blom Bank, Byblos Bank, Franza Bank, etc. It also appears to be stealing credentials. It steals credentials for these, and also apparently Citibank, PayPal, and other well-known international websites. There are a few interesting features of this malware that I kind of want to bring to the table and discuss. One of which is the custom font that it installs. It installs a font called Polidia Narrow, and there doesn't seem to be any real reason for that yet. It may just be that the analysts at Kaspersky haven't dug into it very well. It's not unusual to see fonts used in exploits, and so far they have not figured out the actual infection vector for Gauss. But seeing as that's such a strange thing for malware to do to just install a font, I personally think that, in my opinion, they're going to find something interesting in that font that leads to an exploit. Any opinions on that, Jim?
Yeah, as fonts are not a particularly common way, but they're not entirely unknown either. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what that's all about.
A further indicator in the code that suggests that Lebanon is a target, if the banks and the infection counts aren't enough, is that in the code there is the authors neglected to remove some information, including the build paths, and one of these paths refers to Gauss_white_1, and Kaspersky believes that this is actually a reference to Lebanon itself. The name Lebanon coming from the Semitic root LBN. I'm not much of a linguist, but that's what they say here, meaning white and potentially referring to Mount Lebanon. Maybe a stretch, but the analysts of these malware have Stuxnet and Dooku and the like and Flamer have been looking for attribution in the code, and it may be a pride thing, but some malware authors like to put in code to suggest things or maybe even to hint maybe a possible false flag operation. You never know. But there seems to be strong indications that the code base for Gauss shares a lot of modules with the Flamer malware, although it does not share the same exact intentions.
Yeah, the one thing that kind of struck me is it seemed odd. The Kaspersky article does spend a lot of time talking about state-sponsored malware, and state-sponsored, that phrase is used a number of times. And this seems a little odd for a state-sponsored attack. I mean, I can see maybe going after, the bank accounts of terrorists to try to, wipe out their operations by stealing their money, but this looks more like your normal criminal operation to steal money, to me. That's just from not seeing the malware, just from seeing some of the reports. So.
But at the same time, the malware doesn't focus exclusively on Lebanese banks. It also focuses on sites like Yahoo, Facebook, Gmail, Hotmail, and also looks for other credit card numbers. I mean, it's a little bit confusing. You can't say definitively one way or the other. Is it completely banking malware? Is it completely spy malware? Is it a combination of the both? I mean, you really have to ask the authors at this point.
Yeah. And did the authors sell or buy parts of it, reverse engineer parts of the other malware? Who knows?
That's also very possible that this is not the original crew, but rather someone who's taking pieces of it, either through having stolen the source code itself, most likely having stolen the source code itself, or bought or haggled or stolen. Who knows?
Well, what's very clear is that we don't know everything yet.
That's probably the best way of explaining it, is that there's so much that we still don't know about it.
Right. This is such a breaking thing. This just broke this morning, so we'll certainly know more about this as time goes on. Okay. Thanks, Matt. We do have a very brief internet weather report today. Brian isn't here, and he's the master of doing the big ones, but there was one interesting anomaly this week that I did want to bring to people's attention. Not entirely sure what it's all about yet. So most of the top hitters here we've seen before in some of our recent reports. A lot of this is still related to that DVR botnet that we've been tracking and talking about for months. The one that kind of stuck out to me, though, this week was this third one here, TCP port 548. TCP 548 is AFP over TCP. That's Apple filing protocol. It's the protocol that AppleShare uses. It's for file sharing among Apple devices, Macintoshes primarily. And what we see is a spike that took place late in the day on the 3rd of August, and it was several orders of magnitude above the background noise, which is why it got our attention. Most of the sources are in the U.S. and Korea. Not sure exactly what they were looking for. I have not seen anything about any new vulnerability in AFP. The last vulnerability that I saw about that was something about passing credentials in the clear, and that was 4 or 5 years ago. So I'm not sure exactly what they were looking for here, and it does seem to have dropped off in the last day or so. But if any of you out there are seeing any of this traffic and have any thoughts, we'd be glad to hear from you. Just something to keep your eye out for. Don't have the usual charts or graphs on the top scanning ports and so forth, but again, those are being overwhelmed lately by traffic from that DVR botnet, so hopefully we will make some progress in trying to get that shut down, filter that noise out in the future. And with that, we'll wrap the show up today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can reach us at ThreatTraq@list.att.com. This video program is available at att.com/ThreatTraq and on YouTube, and the audio version is available from iTunes or FeedBurner. Search for ThreatTraq. And as always, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Matt. I'm Jim Clausing. We'll be back next week with another AT&T ThreatTraq. And until then, keep your network safe.